And that's part of what this is all about.
And what you're really seeing is the transfer of the wealth of the American people, what's remaining of it, to these people of great wealth, to the Brotherhood of Darkness. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the only way to protect yourself is with gold and silver-related assets. If you don't have them, you got no hope. And, I told people about the top of the dot-com market. We got everybody out at the top. I called the top, and I was the only one on the real estate market. Called the top on that. And then I called the top on the market at 14,100 Dow. And I called 6,600 as the interim bottom, and that's exactly where it won. And so I think we're looking at a long evolution, and we will have hyperinflation. And then when they want to pull the plug, when they've got several more large wars going, or one big one for that matter, that's when they'll go into deflationary depression. And it's going to happen, and it's going to happen throughout the world. There's going to be chaos. Probably half the nations of the world, their governments will be overthrown. And that is possible in the United States as well. And we're going to see some things we would have never dreamed of.
Well, I think we're living in very, very dangerous times. Let's go to David, who's calling in for Vermont. Our telephone number again is 1-888-24-LIBERTY. 1-888-24-LIBERTY or 464-8295. And David, do you have a question for our guest?
Yes, I had a question about the second bank. When the second bank of the United States was abolished during Jackson's term, we didn't have a central bank. How did the country survive and prosper through many decades between that time and the time that the Federal Reserve came in?
All right, that's a very legitimate question. How did America survive? They closed down the second bank of the United States. It actually was been closed down. Certainly, it became a private bank. I think about 1837, and then of course it eventually went bankrupt in 1841. But then we had a period, certainly from about 1836 up until 1913 without a central bank. How did America prosper during that time?
The monetary responsibilities of the country were taken over by the U.S. Treasury, which they always had that power under the Constitution. And so that's how it was done.
And we did,
that's what we want to revert it to, because we'll get more transparency than you would with a privately owned Fed that won't even tell federal courts what it's doing. They say, we don't have to. Take a hike.
Well, I think the thing is that, certainly, David, what we did during that time, you had state banks, and the state banks could create credit too. But at least they couldn't all conspire together to take over the government and to rig the market. And they had to act responsibly, because if they had a run on their bank and they let out too much money, created too much credit, and they couldn't, of course, refund the money of the depositors, they went off to Huskar or run out of town on a rail and all covered with tar and feathers. So believe me, banks acted responsibly because they were answerable to the states. But we have a situation today where we have a central bank that is above the government, that really runs our economy and is owned by the central banks. And so basically now they want to give the Fed, which is owned by the central banks, more control over banking. We live in a world gone mad. Anything else, David?
Yes. So at this point, we only have a central bank. We have no state banks. We have only private banks and commercial banks, and no so-called state banks. Is that correct?
Bob, we want to...
No, you do. You have state-chartered banks.
So we have a few, and they are not part of the Federal Reserve System.
They don't belong to the FDIC system, nor to the federal system under the Fed.
They're not very many, but they're there, and God bless them for being there. They actually have a state bank, and I think it's in North Dakota. They do not have a recession there. They got plenty of money to lend. But they're not in on the scam with the big banks that want to destroy our economy. That's the difference.
I have one final question. Did Did AIG have anything to do with the FDIC? And then I'll hang up now. Thank you.
All right. What about the AIG? That's the American Investment Group, and that's Hank Greenberg Group, and they've really scammed the public. I mean, they've transferred billions of dollars to their insiders. What's the relationship to that to the Fed?
Well, he said the FDIC.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And as far as I know, none.
Because they're not a bank. They're not a bank.
No, it's not a bank.
Right, and so
or it wasn't before. And the relationship with the Fed was non-existent, except they were on speaking terms, and they all knew each other because Greenberg was one of the top people in the Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. So these guys were all in bed together.
Right.
And AIG was a front for the CIA and the OSS before it for years and years. And so that's why it was saved. And besides that, they had written naked derivatives to the tune of $105.4 billion. And that money was funneled through AIG to the people who had been sold these derivatives that AIG could not pay for. And the American taxpayer paid AIG's bill.
$185 billion being
funneled. No, 105.4.
105.4?
Yeah, and they wouldn't tell anybody what they were doing. About 6 months ago, and all of a sudden the news came out that they were laundering money through there. And who was the big one to get bailed out? About 13 or 11 billion? Goldman Sachs. And J.P. Morgan Chase, and on and on. But we don't have any money for Social Security.
I wonder why. Well, my telephone number, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, or 464-8295. Love to hear your questions for Bob, because basically we are facing the worst economic crisis. Some people say in 200 years, some people say in 300 years. What do you think about that?
Well, I think internationally in the last 500 years, in America, the biggest ever. By far, far, far. I mean, we can go back to the collapse of the Hanseatic League in the early 1600s, which almost took the Medici Empire down. And if you want to skip back a couple of centuries before that, you can go to the collapse of the Lombard system in 1348, the year of the plague, which nowadays is significant in as much as we got government planning to kill off half the people in the world.
And I really think that people really need to understand history, and of course you need to understand the Medici's and it's, there in Florence, and certainly what happened time and time. There's nothing new under the sun. These things have happened time and again. They never work, and our leaders know that. Somebody called and asked, why are they letting all the immigrants into the country while our country is in such financial difficulty? That's a good question. Why are we letting them in and giving them welfare and food stamps and free medical care and subsidized education here in California? Why are we encouraging people to come into our country illegally?
Well, I think it's because Stan needs inexpensive gardeners.
We don't have an inexpensive gardener. I wish we did.
No, it's because they want people who come in to be nationalized into American citizens, and then they can collect taxes from them, and that'll fill that gap. That's why they got to get immigration legislation within the next 2 years to start pouring money into Social Security and into revenue to offset the interest they have to pay on the debt. And, of course, another reason for these wonderful free market corporatists is they get slave labor. And so those are the two main reasons.
Well, I think people have to understand the reason aren't there any jobs because there's no credit available. You can't borrow money to start a business. And certainly people are not going to invest in businesses because these are uncertain times. And so if you can't borrow money and people don't have the money to be investing and starting businesses, there are not going to be any jobs. And I think we're going to lose a lot more jobs. And as long as there are no new jobs, why, of course, we're going to continuing endangering Medicare and Social Security. And certainly one of these days they're going to run out of welfare benefits. Already Medicare is costing more than it's taking in. That's why they're so desperate to do something about it. They already have the death boards. Sarah Palin's been going around talking about the death boards, and everybody's saying it isn't true. It was in the stimulus bill. It was in the stimulus bill. It's already the law of the land, and there's now one person in 1,000 who knows about it.